Hey guys, imagine waking up to the smell of smoke and manure, the wind whining through narrow slits, and realizing your smart home is a 900-year-old stone brain designed to outlast armies and storms. That's the genius of medieval castles. Before we dive in, hit like if you love weird engineering. Let me know in the comments where you want me to storm next, and dim the lights. Get comfortable, because I'm about to drop you inside one of these fortresses. You step over a puddle of filth, boots ringing on cold flagstone. A sentry barks. Who goes there? And you mutter, "It's just me," while murder holes above consider redecorating your day. Every groove, every jutting tower, every stink-filled latrine was part of a deliberate plan. Arrow slits the size of your phone, spiral staircases that favor right-handed attackers. Walls so thick they muffled siege engines. Pragmatic, brutal, brilliant. Think of a castle like a medieval startup. Ruthless user testing, no refunds. But engineering so clever, it still makes modern architects squint. Plus, the toilets tell you more about social hierarchy than any corporate org chart. So tell me, are you team stone and murder hole, or team open plan co-working? Let me know in the comments. And if you want a deep dive on a specific keep, hit subscribe, and I'll bring the blueprint. The valley of Eldermore lay shrouded in a permanent veil of mist, the kind that makes you think the world forgot to turn off its fog machine. Lord Rowan rode up the ragged path, his cloak flapping like a flag at a medieval rock concert, and summoned the famed master mason Alaric. Alaric arrived with a satchel of chalk, a battered ledger, and a grin that suggested he'd already imagined the castle's future ghosts. The Lord gestured toward the craggy hill that rose like a stubborn toddler, refusing to sit still. Together, they stood on the wind-swept summit, the air tasting of damp stone and distant pine sap. Alaric spread his rough-hewn map on a slab of granite and began sketching circles that would become concentric defenses. Think of a medieval onion, but without the tears. We'll need an outer wall that can shrug off a battering ram, and an inner keep that could survive a dragon's sneeze. He quipped, earning a chuckle from Rowan, who imagined a dragon with allergies. The two men argued over the thickness of the walls, the placement of towers, and whether a moat should be filled with water or, for comedic effect, cheap ale. Their voices rose and fell like a tavern bard's ballad, echoing off the stone and the distant cliffs. The sun, lazy and half-hidden, painted the valley in amber, making the future stones glint like promise. When dawn finally broke, the first stones were hauled up the slope by a crew of burly laborers who smelled of sweat, mud, and the occasional stray goat. Alaric crouched, his hands dusted with limestone grit, and tapped a stone into place with the satisfaction of a gamer landing a perfect combo. The clang of hammer on stone rang out, a metallic heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the valley's fog. Below, a river gurgled, occasionally splashing up with a frothy bite that left a salty taste on the workers' lips. As the foundation took shape, a lone raven perched on the half-built wall, cawing as if to say, "Nice job, guys. Now don't forget the Wi-Fi." Lord Rowan watched the progress with a mixture of pride and the nervous twitch of a cat near a rocking chair. He whispered to Alaric that the castle must also impress visiting dignitaries, lest they think Ravenshold was just a fancy stone sandbox. Alaric laughed, noting that a good keep should have secret passages, hidden rooms, and perhaps a hidden karaoke chamber after all. Even knights need to belt out a ballad now. And then the workers, meanwhile, swapped stories of past sieges, each tale spicier than the last, complete with descriptions of rotten cheese and siege engines that smelled like burnt hair. The irony was not lost on anyone. They were building a fortress to keep out danger. Yet the real danger was the ever-growing pile of half-eaten rations rotting in the corner. By sunset, the foundation of Ravenshold stood firm, a solid rectangle of stone that seemed to whisper, "We've got your back, Lord Rowan." Alaric stepped back, feeling the cool stone against his cheek like a mother-board's steady hum. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, fresh cut timber, and the faint promise of future battles. Rowan clapped Alaric on the shoulder, joking that the next phase would involve hiring a wizard to enchant the drawbridge, because who doesn't love a little magic with their masonry? As the mist rolled back in, the hill took on a silhouette that looked like a sleeping dragon, ready to awaken when the realm called upon it. Alaric stood on the trembling scaffold, his boots splintering fresh mortar as masons heaved stone after stone into the sky. The curtain walls rose like a stone-clad dragon, each block humming with the clang of iron tongs and the salty bite of sweat. Sunlight bounced off the rough limestone, turning the surface into a glittering armor that seemed to mock the low-lying cottages beyond. Workers shouted orders in guttural Latin, their voices echoing off the nascent barrier like a chorus of angry geese. By dusk, the skeleton of the wall loomed, promising both protection and a headache for any would-be invader. Next came the moat, a yawning trench filled with water as black as spilled ink and as foul as a dragon's breath. Alaric ordered the ditch to be deep enough to swallow a horse and wide enough to make a knight think twice before attempting a graceful leap. The water rotted the wooden stakes driven into its bed, releasing a stench of rot and algae that made the nearby peasants wrinkle their noses. When the tide rose, the surface rippled with the reflection of the new walls, turning the whole scene into a medieval mirror maze. Even the crows perched on the edge seemed to caw in disapproval, as if the moat were a giant, inconvenient bathtub. At the heart of the defenses rose the gatehouse, a hulking stone beast with portcullises that dropped like the jaws of a hungry T-Rex. Alaric watched the iron grates clatter shut, each clang reverberating like a medieval drum roll announcing doom. Above the entrance, murder holes yawned, ready to rain boiling oil, hot sand, or a surprise volley of rotten eggs on any foolish soul who dared charge. The gate's wooden doors bore iron bands, their scent a mix of pine resin and the lingering perfume of fear. Guards paced the parapets, their helmets glinting, while a lone minstrel inside tried to hum a tune that sounded suspiciously like the opening theme of a space opera. The genius of Alaric's layered protection lay in its maddening redundancy, forcing attackers to play a medieval version of Escape Room with no cheat codes. First, they waded through the fetid moat, hoping their boots wouldn't stick to the slime like a bad Tinder date. Then they faced the towering curtain wall, scaling it with ladders that creaked under the weight of ambition and a chorus of jeering villagers. Even if they survived those trials, the gatehouse waited with its portcullis snapping, shut faster than a Netflix buffering screen. By the time a determined foe reached the inner keep, they were drenched, exhausted, and probably wishing they'd taken a vacation instead of a siege. Alaric surveyed his masterpiece with a grin as wide as the moat, knowing that any enemy would need more than brute force to breach his fortress. The layered defenses acted like a medieval firewall, each layer filtering out the dregs of aggression like spam in an ancient inbox. Modern security geeks might call it defense in depth. But back then, it was simply common sense wrapped in stone, iron, and a splash of nasty water. As the sun set, the walls cast long shadows that seemed to whisper, "You shall not pass," to anyone daring enough to listen. In the end, the castle stood not just as a shelter, but as a testament to the art of making troublemakers work twice as hard for half the fun. When the first stone of the keep rose, the masons whispered that the walls were as clever as a court jester's riddles. Hidden stairways snaked behind tapestry-laden corridors, their steps slick with the damp of centuries. A lone torch flickered, casting shadows that danced like gossip at a tavern. The stonework sang of both siege-ready bulwarks and secret shortcuts for a midnight snack run, proving that medieval engineers loved a good plot twist. Down in the vaulted kitchens, the air swelled with the roar of a wood-filled hearth and the pungent perfume of roasting boar mingling with sour cabbage. Massive stone arches cradled massive cauldrons that boiled broth so thick you could swim in it if you weren't afraid of the occasional splatter of burnt onions. The cooks, armed with wooden spoons like medieval whisks, shouted orders louder than a dragon's sneeze, their voices echoing off the stone like a medieval rock concert. Even the rats seemed to tap their tiny feet to the rhythm, turning the kitchen into a bustling, slightly greasy ballroom. Below the great hall, a self-sustaining cistern collected rainwater with the devotion of a monk chanting his prayers. Water dripped down limestone walls, creating a steady, soothing percussion that masked the clank of armor above. When the summer heat baked the courtyard, the garrison drew cool, mineral-rich water that tasted faintly of iron, just enough to remind them they were still alive. The cistern's hidden pipes whispered through the stone, a silent network that kept the keep from turning into a dusty ghost town. All this ingenuity served a single purpose: to let warriors fight like lions, while still being able to bake a decent loaf of bread. The keep's design married the clang of swords with the clatter of plates, showing that a castle could be both a fortress and a home. Yet, as the sun set behind the battlements, rumors slithered through the stone like a snake in the grass. Lord Heron, the rival lord, was said to be gathering a surprise assault. The garrison's laughter turned to nervous glances, and even the cooks paused, knives hovering above the stew, as the scent of danger mixed with rosemary. By night, the keep hummed with the low murmur of soldiers swapping tall tales, some claiming the rivals' troops were as stealthy as ninjas, others insisting they moved like a herd of clumsy oxen. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A stone giant built to repel invaders now relied on secret stairways and hidden cisterns, basically medieval cheat codes. As the moon painted the tower silver, a lone guard chuckled, comparing the castle's hidden passages to a modern video game cheat menu. He muttered, "If only we could respawn," and the night settled into an uneasy, yet oddly comforting, lull. The sky over Ravensholt boiled with the iron-gray clouds of war, as Lord Malric's banners snapped in the wind like angry flags. From the hill, the castle loomed, a stone beast with 3 concentric walls that curled around the keep like a medieval onion, each layer a stubborn sigh against the oncoming storm. The scent of damp mortar mingled with the acrid tang of fresh blood from a stray scout, while the clang of armor echoed like a drum roll for the drama about to unfold. Inside, the garrison tightened their grips on spear tips, their breaths forming ghostly ribbons in the chilly dawn. Even the ravens perched on the battlements seemed to caw a warning, as if they'd seen this siege before in some ancient meme of history. Malric's trebuchets roared to life, hurling massive oak-filled projectiles that thudded against the outer wall with a sound like a giant's heartbeat. The first wall shuddered, then gave a muffled sigh as the impact was absorbed, its thick limestone acting like a medieval shock absorber. Think of a car's bumper, but made of grief and granite. Sparks flew, and the smell of splintered wood and scorched leather filled the air, making the defenders' stomachs churn like a cauldron of stew. Yet the second wall stood firm, its inner face slick, with a thin layer of wet sand the engineers had poured in anticipation, turning the siege engine's fury into a sloppy, ineffective mess. By the time the third wall faced the barrage, the attackers were left with nothing but a pile of broken trebuchet ropes and a chorus of muttering soldiers, as if they'd tried to break a password with a hammer. While the enemy huffed and puffed, the castle's hidden passages whispered their own secret anthem. Narrow stairwells, slick with moss and the occasional rat's droppings, wound like veins beneath the stone, leading to concealed arrow slits that opened onto the battlefield like surprise party pop-ups. Defenders slipped through these tunnels, their boots squelching in the damp earth, and emerged to rain bolts and boiling oil on unsuspecting siege crews. An early version of guerrilla warfare meets a medieval tick-tock challenge. The clatter of shields and the guttural shouts of the archers blended with the metallic tang of blood, creating a cacophony that made the attackers' morale wobble like a jelly cake. Even the castle's resident cat, Sir Whiskers, darted through the shadows, adding a flicker of fur and a hiss that seemed to say, "You shall not pass, you overgrown peasants." When the moon rose, pale and mischievous, the defenders gathered at the mouth of the deepest tunnel, a secret passage known only to the Lord's most trusted squire, who swore it was built for emergency pizza deliveries. With torches clenched between teeth, they slipped into the darkness, the air growing cold enough to make their breath freeze into ghostly ribbons. The tunnel slithered beneath the enemy camp, its walls slick with the slime of centuries, and opened behind the siege engines like a backstage door at a rock concert. In a flash of steel and shouted battle cries, the raiding party burst out, catching the besiegers off guard, their faces illuminated by the sudden blaze of torchlight and the glow of panic. The surprise attack turned the siege into a chaotic dance, as Malric's men scrambled like NPCs in a video game that had just glitched, tripping over their own weapons and shouting, "What the?" By dawn, the once confident army of Lord Malric lay in disarray, their banners torn, their morale shattered like a cheap porcelain vase. The defenders, drenched in sweat, blood, and the sweet smell of victory, stood atop the walls, their laughter echoing over the courtyard like a chorus of victorious goblins. Ravenshold's ingenious design had not only survived, it had turned the very stone into a weapon, proving that sometimes the best defense is a well-placed secret door and a dash of audacity. As the sun painted the sky in gold, Lord Malric slunk away, muttering about cursed castles, while the castle's cooks began preparing a celebratory stew, complete with the extra spicy flavor of irony. And somewhere, high above, a lone raven cawed, perhaps reciting the tale for future generations, or simply demanding a snack. The last catapult bolt clanged against the outer wall, and the enemy's morale cracked like a stale biscuit. When the siege finally broke, a thin plume of smoke rose from Ravenshold's battlements, carrying the scent of burnt pitch and victory. Soldiers staggered out, their armor clanking, eyes wide at the sight of the keep's towering silhouette, a jagged tooth against the twilight sky. Inside, the great hall echoed with the guttural cheers of men who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. Even the rats, emboldened by the feast, scurried over the flagstones, squeaking a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a medieval rock band. Alaric, the mastermind behind the stonework, had woven cleverness into every buttress, like a wizard slipping spells into mortar. His angled walls deflected projectiles, the way a modern superhero's shield bounces laser blasts, and hidden staircases whispered soldiers past enemy eyes. Word of his genius spread faster than gossip about a royal scandal, reaching distant lords who begged for blueprints. Soon, the kingdom's new forts sported Alaric's grin, a sly, sloping tower that made attackers feel as if the castle were smirking back. Even the humble mason's apprentice could point to the designs and say, "That's how you turn stone into a cheat code for war." With the bloodshed behind them, Ravenshold shed its war-weary skin and slipped into a silkier role as the kingdom's cultural hub. Minstrels set up in the courtyard, their lutes jangling against the clatter of market stalls, selling spiced cheese and fermented cabbage that made the air both pungent and inviting. Scholars huddled in the tower's highest window, ink staining their fingertips as they drafted laws that would outlive any siege. The great hall, once echoing with battle cries, now resonated with debates, poetry recitals, and the occasional drunken toast that sounded like a medieval karaoke night. Even the castle's moat, once a grim ditch of cold water, became a reflective mirror for lantern light, turning the whole place into a glittering Instagram backdrop. If Instagram had existed in 1387, Ravenshold's stone walls began to feel less like cold barriers and more like a living diary, each crack a footnote in the saga of human ambition. The locals joked that the castle was older than their grandmothers and twice as stubborn, refusing to be demolished even by the king's tax collectors. Its legacy seeped into songs, with bards comparing its resilience to the indestructible Death Star only with more torches and fewer laser beams. Travelers from far lands marveled at how a pile of rocks could host banquets, courts, and the occasional love affair, proving that engineering and romance aren't mutually exclusive. Ironically, the very defenses that once kept enemies out now welcomed ideas, turning the fortress into a think tank where strategies were plotted over steaming mugs of ale. As centuries turned, Ravenshold's silhouette remained a steadfast bookmark in the kingdom's story, reminding every passerby that stone can sing if you listen. New generations added their own touches, a glassy chapel window here, a brass bell there. Yet the heart of Alaric's design pulsed unchanged. Today, children chase shadows in the ancient corridors, their laughter bouncing off the same walls that once rattled with arrows, proving that legacy is less about permanence and more about echo. When the wind whistles through the battlements, it carries a whisper. Build wisely, laugh loudly, and never underestimate a good moat. And so, Ravenshold stands, not merely as a relic of medieval engineering, but as a stone-crowned testament that human ingenuity can turn cold rock into a living legend. As the autumn wind rattled the thatch of Eldon's tavern, Lord Aldrich burst in, his cloak flapping like a banner at a medieval rock concert. He thrust a wax-sealed summons into the hands of the village's only master mason, Rowan, whose beard was as tangled as a dragon's tail. We need a fortress yesterday, Aldrich growled, eyes darting toward the distant hills where warlord Gervise was amassing a ragtag army that smelled of sweat and burnt pork. Rowan, who'd once built a stone bridge that survived a goat stampede, raised an eyebrow and whispered, "You want a castle or a quick-draw fort?" The Lord's grin was as sharp as a newly forged sword, and the two men set off toward the lone mound that rose like a sleeping giant on the outskirts of the village. The mound, an ancient, wind-eroded hill, loomed over the marshy fields, its slopes slick with rain puddles that reflected the gray sky like a giant, muddy mirror. Aldrich declared it the perfect motte, a natural earth tower that could be crowned with timber walls faster than you could say Game of Thrones. Rowan knelt, scooped a handful of loam, and let the gritty scent of wet soil slip between his fingers. Noting how the earth clung like a stubborn burr, he sketched a rough plan on a bark tablet, promising a wooden keep that would sit atop the mound like a crown on a king's head, while the surrounding bailey would spread like a defensive blanket. The villagers watched, half amused and half terrified, as the two leaders began to argue whether the motte should be called Mount Doom or just the hill. Dawn broke with a chorus of crows cackling like medieval hecklers, and Rowan's crew of laborers swung their shovels with the vigor of a pop song dance routine. The earth gave up its secrets in layers of mud, clods, and the occasional worm that squirmed out like a surprise cameo in a horror movie. Rowan barked orders. Raise the timber. We need a palisade that can keep out Gervise and his bad breath. And the men hoisted logs that smelled of pine resin and fresh cut pine needle perfume. Sweat dripped into their eyes, mixing with the smell of dung from nearby cattle, creating a perfume no noble would ever wear to a banquet. By midday, a crude wooden tower rose on the motte, its silhouette jagged against the sky like a medieval Lego set gone rogue. That night, the wind howled through the newly built walls, rattling the makeshift doors, as if the fortress itself were auditioning for a horror flick. The scent of fire, cooked beans wafted from the Bailey's central fire pit, mingling with the acrid bite of charcoal and the less pleasant odor of a goat that had escaped its pen. Rowan stood atop the motte, feeling the wooden beams creak under his weight, and imagined Gervise's troops trying to scale the hill only to slip on the slick, mud-slicked stones. An accidental slapstick comedy. From the village, a child shouted, "Look, it's like a medieval Minecraft." And the adults chuckled, their nerves loosening for the first time since the summons arrived. As the stars pierced the night, Aldrich raised a goblet of mead, toasted the motte's sturdy silhouette, and whispered, "If this holds, we've just invented fast forward fortification." By sunrise, the motte and Bailey stood as a testament to human ingenuity and the absurdity of building a castle in a weekend. Gervise's scouts, eyes wide with disbelief, reported back that the fortress looked like something straight out of a fantasy video game, but with more mud. Rowan, wiping grit from his forearms, laughed that the only thing missing was a dragon perched on the keep, though he'd settle for a sturdy drawbridge. Aldrich, his cloak now dusted with earth, felt a surge of pride that rivaled any knight's victory chant. Knowing the village now had a place to hunker down when the war drums rolled, the story of the motte's birth would travel far, told around hearths with the same gusto as a bard's ballad, reminding all that sometimes the best defenses rise from the ground beneath our feet. The first day the timber walls rose, the air smelled of fresh pine and sweat. Rowan, the master mason with a habit of humming medieval chants, paced the perimeter. Beneath the clatter of hammers, he heard a faint gurgle, a hidden spring bubbling through ancient earthworks. He knelt, feeling the cool mud ooze between his fingers, and realized the water could feed the Bailey for years. The villagers gathered, eyes wide, as the motte's shadow stretched over the newly drawn labyrinth of huts. With a grin, Rowan sketched a network of secret tunnels that would snake like a cat burglar in a Disney castle. He traced the spring's path into the hill, envisioning stone-lined corridors that could hide messengers or a rogue's pantry. The ancient earthworks, long forgotten, offered natural arches perfect for covert doors that creaked only when the wind whispered open sesame. As the workers hewed the soil, the scent of damp loam mixed with the metallic tang of blood from a stray axe slip, reminding everyone that building a fortress is part art, part slapstick. By sunset, the first hidden hatch lay half buried, a promise of escape that would make even a Game of Thrones plot twist blush. But the merriment attracted unwanted eyes. Spies from Gervais slipped into the bailey disguised as traveling minstrels. They tucked poisoned arrows into their lutes and whispered sabotage plans over ale, their accents as thin as parchment. That night a torch sputtered out, and a section of the palisade collapsed in a cloud of splintered wood and angry crows. Rowan caught a glint of a foreign sigil etched on a broken stake, and realized the minstrels were anything but melodic. The alarm bells rang, echoing like a medieval alarm clock, and the construction crew scrambled, brandishing shovels as if they were swords. The villagers, already jittery from the sudden rain of splinters, began muttering that the fortress was cursed. Aldrich, the lord with a beard as stubborn as a goat, marched into the crowd, his voice booming like a tavern brawler demanding last orders. He promised that the hidden passages would protect their children, even if the spies tried to turn the bailey into a giant hamster wheel. Yet a mother clutched her newborn, eyes darting to the fresh trench, and whispered that the water smelled like rotten cheese, feeding her doubts. Aldrich's resolve hardened. He knelt beside the spring, drank the cold water, and declared, "If this fortress falls, at least we'll die with fresh taste in our throats." Construction roared on, hammers striking wood like a drumbeat in a war movie soundtrack. Secret tunnels grew beneath the mud, their walls slick with slime that made even the bravest foreman recoil. The spies, thwarted by a cleverly placed pitfall, slipped into the very passages they'd hoped to sabotage, emerging covered in muck and muttering curses that sounded suspiciously like a bad rap verse. When the final palisade beam was hoisted, the bailey buzzed with an uneasy triumph, the scent of pine mingling with the sweet smell of victory and a hint of burnt rope. Aldrich looked over the completed labyrinth, chuckling that they'd built a fortress worthy of a Netflix fantasy series, and whispered to Rowan, "Now, let's see if the walls can keep out the gossip." The sky cracked open as Gervais rode down the winding path, his banner snapping like a nervous cat in a wind tunnel. Below him, the motte, an earthen hill crowned with a timber keep, loomed like a stubborn toddler refusing to be moved. His legion, a ragtag band of steel-clad veterans and fresh recruits, clattered onto the bailey, their boots stirring dust that smelled of horse, sweat, and ambition. For the first time since the keep's foundation was laid, the ancient motte and bailey faced a true trial, and Gervais could feel the weight of history pressing against his armor. He raised his sword, shouting a war cry that sounded suspiciously like a medieval version of "Let's get this party started." The enemy's trebuchets roared to life, hurling massive stones that thudded against the outer palisade with the force of 1,000 angry drummers. Splinters rained down, and the air filled with the acrid bite of burnt pitch and the metallic tang of blood from wounded archers. Inside the bailey, the granaries creaked under the strain of dwindling supplies. Their once sweet grain, now a stale reminder of scarcity. Whispers curled through the corridors like smoke, each murmur a tiny dagger to morale, as men wondered whether the walls would hold long enough for a miracle. Even the castle's resident cat seemed to have given up, perched on a crumbling stone with a look that said, "I'm not paying for this." Amid the clamor, Aldrich, the stoic master of stone, paced the ramparts, his beard twitching with every impact as if it were a nervous pet. Beside him, Rowan, a quick-witted engineer with a penchant for improvisation, traced his finger over the hidden tunnel map etched into a damp slab of wood. Their eyes met, and a silent agreement sparked. The secret passages that once served smugglers and lovers would now become the lifeline of the defenders. They whispered plans that sounded like a badly rehearsed heist scene from a pirate movie, promising to slip behind enemy lines and sabotage the siege engines. The irony was delicious. Those who built the walls for protection now had to become the walls themselves. Under the cover of night, a handful of brave souls slipped into the earthworm tunnels, their lanterns flickering like fireflies on a caffeine binge. The tunnels, cool and damp, smelled of moss and old goat droppings, a sensory reminder that medieval engineering was not always glamorous. Emerging behind the besiegers, they set crude but effective traps. Overturned barrels, sticky tar, and a surprise barrage of rotten eggs that sent the enemy soldiers slipping like characters in a slapstick cartoon. The trebuchet crews, distracted by the sudden chaos, missed a crucial loading, and a massive stone crashed harmlessly into the moat, sending a spray of water that soaked the attacker's armor. Gervais, hearing the distant yelps, let out a laugh that echoed off the stone, thinking, "Well, that's one way to give them a splash hit." By dawn, the siege engines lay in ruins, their twisted timbers resembling the tangled hair of a disheveled rock star. The defenders, though bruised and smelling faintly of sweat and tar, rallied around the fire pits, sharing the last of the hardtack with a grin that said, "We survived the worst of it. Now let's feast like it's Game of Thrones, but with fewer betrayals." Aldrich clapped Rowan on the back, remarking that the hidden tunnels had proved more reliable than any royal decree. The enemy, humbled and covered in mud, retreated with their tails between their legs, muttering about cursed castles and bad luck. And so, the Motte and Bailey earned its legend, proving that a clever design and a dash of humor can turn a siege of shadows into a sunrise of triumph. The moon hung like a dull lantern over the Motte and Bailey, and Gervaise's men crept forward on goat skin boots that squeaked like a squeaky toy in a silent theater. Their torches threw jittery shadows against the timber Bailey wall, where the clang of a battered battering ram echoed like a bad metal concert. With a deafening crash, the gate gave way, spilling a tide of mud-caked soldiers into the courtyard. The scent of sweat, blood, and damp earth rose like a pungent perfume, and the night air crackled with the electric tension of a storm about to break. Even the owls seemed to hoot in protest, as if the forest itself had tuned into a medieval version of a siege movie trailer. Gervaise's vanguard wasted no time, hurling flaming bundles into the heart of the timber keep, and watching the wooden beams roar to life like a dragon with a bad case of heartburn. Sparks sprayed like fireworks, and the smell of burning resin mingled with the acrid tang of charred flesh, making the defenders' throats feel like they were chewing on hot coals. The blaze leapt from roof to roof, licking the night sky and turning the keep into a glowing beacon for any wandering minstrel. Yet, hidden beneath the chaos, Rowan's secret fire breaks, narrow stone corridors packed with damp sand, snickered at the inferno, refusing to let the flames cross their invisible line. It was as if the fortress had installed a medieval version of a fire-stop door, and the invaders were none the wiser, like villains in a sitcom who keep tripping over the same banana peel. When the flames surged higher, Rowan shouted for the garrison to retreat to the Motte, the earthen mound that crowned the keep like a stubborn hill of stubbornness. Soldiers scrambled up the steep, crumbling steps, their boots kicking up clouds of ash that stung their eyes like sand in a sandstorm. From the elevated keep, they could see the Bailey below turning into a molten cauldron, the heat licking their faces, and the smell of burnt pine making them gag. Ironically, the very height that made the keep a target also became their salvation, offering a dry, stone-capped refuge that the fire could not swallow. The view was both terrifying and oddly cinematic, as if they were perched on a medieval version of the Death Star, watching the planet burn. Amid the inferno, Aldrich slipped into the concealed passages that wound beneath the Motte like a secret subway system for knights. He rallied a band of hardened men, their faces smeared with soot and determination, and whispered a plan that sounded like a plot twist in a binge watched fantasy series. They hauled buckets of water, doused the fire breaks, and then turned the soaked timber into makeshift catapults, hurling flaming debris back at the attackers with the gust of a medieval fireworks show. The invaders, caught off guard by the sudden rain of burning logs, stumbled and shouted, their morale cracking like a poorly baked loaf. Aldrich's counter-strike turned the blaze into a weapon of its own, forcing Gervais's men to retreat as if they'd just been hit by a surprise cameo from a dragon in a sitcom. When the last ember sputtered out, the motte stood scarred but unbowed, its stone walls still echoing with the crackle of dying flames. The defenders, drenched in sweat and ash, shared a grim chuckle, noting that they had just survived a night that felt like a medieval mash up of Game of Thrones. And a low-budget action flick, Rowan surveyed the charred Bailey, his eyes twinkling with ironic triumph, and declared that the fire breaks had earned their keep alive status, no warranty needed. Aldrich, leaning on his sword, raised a toast with a mug of sour ale, proclaiming that the fortress was now officially fireproof, at least until the next drunken lord decides to test it again. As dawn's pale light crept over the horizon, the fortress stood resolute, a testament to stone, cunning, and the occasional well-timed splash of water. The clamor of battle faded, and Eldon's fields inhaled a sigh of peace. Farmers emerged from their huts, wiping soot from faces, while children chased the stray goats that had escaped the chaos. The sky, once bruised with arrows, cleared to a crisp blue that made the distant hills look like a watercolor. In the heart of the valley, the Motte End Bailey rose, its timber walls still smelling of charred pine and fresh earth. Even the wind seemed to tip its hat, whispering, "We survived." The motte, a mound of packed clay and stone, wore a crown of grass that swayed like a nervous audience. Its bailey, a low-walled courtyard, cradled the market stalls that now sold honey cakes instead of blood-soaked rations. Hidden beneath the ramparts, a series of stone levers and counterweights, engineered by a dwarf who once tried to build a catapult for a cat, still clicked in secret. When the sun hit the western facade, the shadows formed a crude map of the old siege, a reminder that architecture can fight as much as swords. The whole complex hummed with a quiet pride, as if the walls themselves were chuckling at the notion that defense could be both brutal and beautiful. Rowan, ink-stained fingers trembling, traced the hidden mechanisms with a quill that squeaked like a mouse in a library. He scribbled diagrams on parchment, so thin they fluttered like moth wings, annotating each lever with jokes about push button for the lazy lord. As night fell, the flickering torchlight turned the stone grooves into silver veins, and Rowan whispered, Future generations will thank me when they don't have to climb the ladder like a hamster on a wheel. He sealed the scroll in a leather case, tucking it beneath a loose flagstone that only a true seeker could find. The smell of damp earth and old oil lamps clung to him. A perfume he'd later claim was the scent of knowledge mixed with mildew. Aldrich, the battle-scarred commander, stood at the base of the motte, his armor dented and his eyes heavy with memory. He could still hear the clang of swords, the screams of the wounded, and the occasional, oddly comforting, "Yo, what's up?" shouted by a squire who thought the siege was a video game. The cost of war lingered in the taste of iron on his tongue and the ache in his shoulders, like a bad hangover after a feast of victory. Yet he also felt a strange gratitude for the earth that had swallowed the enemy's siege towers and turned them into harmless mounds of mud. With a wry grin, he muttered, "If only we could have paid the enemy in pizza, they might have left earlier." As twilight painted the stones amber, the motte end bailey seemed to pulse with a promise that would outlast even the oldest bard's tale. Its foundations, rooted in stubborn clay, would guard the realm for centuries, like a faithful dog that never forgets its owner's scent. Children would someday climb its ramps, giggling at the hidden levers, while scholars would study Rowan's scrolls and nod at his puns. The echo of stone, wind, and whispered jokes would become the kingdom's lullaby, assuring that peace, though fragile, is built on more than just walls. And somewhere, perhaps in a distant future, a star trooper might marvel at the medieval Wi-Fi of these ancient defenses, proving that good design never truly goes out of style. The wind howls across the ragged cliffs of Eldermer like a gossiping tavern keeper, carrying the scent of pine sap and distant smoke. Lord Eric, a man whose beard could double as a rope ladder, surveys the bruised earth where his new keep will rise. He orders a moat so deep it could swallow a dragon's breakfast, and a gatehouse stout enough to make a modern security guard weep. The workers, mud-caked and sweating, grin at the promise of a job that will outlast their grandkids' gossip. As the first shovel bites the soil, a low rumble hints that this stone and water will soon have a story to tell. Daybreak finds the moat taking shape, a trench that glistens like a black mirror under the sunrise. Water from the mountain stream rushes in, churning into a frothy, muddy soup that smells of algae and iron, nature's own perfume for a battlefield. Laborers splash through the cold, their boots squelching like overcooked noodles, while the sound of hammers echoing off the damp walls sounds like a drumline on a war movie set. Children from the nearby hamlet toss pebbles, giggling as they watch the water swallow their toys, oblivious to the strategic genius at work. Even the crows seem to hold a council, cawing about the fresh fish that will soon make a feast for any siege. When the gatehouse finally rises, it looks like a stone-clad beast with eyes of arrow slits, daring any fool to poke its nose. Its portcullis drops with a clang louder than a medieval metal band, sending a shiver down the spine of any would-be invader. Inside, the great hall is lined with tapestries depicting heroic deeds. One even shows a knight battling a Wi-Fi router, a subtle nod to the perils of modern connectivity. The guards, trained to stare down a charging boar, now practice with crossbows, their breath fogging in the cold stone corridors like ghostly whispers. A mischievous squire once tried to hide a rubber duck in the drawbridge's hinge, proving that even fortifications need a splash of levity. Rumors drift like smoke from Bren's camp, where the rival warlord sharpens his axe while polishing a cracked mirror to admire his own scarred visage. Bren, whose nickname, the Bull, stems from his habit of charging through negotiations, eyes Eric's construction with a mix of envy and irritation. He sends a messenger, a lanky minstrel with a lute that sounds like a squeaky door, to taunt Eric, claiming the moat will only trap the keep's own laundry. Eric laughs, slapping his thigh, and replies that the water will drown more than socks. It will drown Bren's ambitions if he dares cross it. The tension crackles like a firefly swarm, each side waiting for the other to make the first splash. As twilight drapes the keep in violet shadows, torches flicker on the ramparts, casting dancing silhouettes that look suspiciously like the Avengers assembling. If the Avengers wore chainmail and smelled of sweat, the moat reflects the stars, turning the water into a glittering runway for any midnight marauder with a taste for drama. Inside the gatehouse, Eric raises a mug of ale, toasting the stone, the water, and the inevitable showdown, his voice echoing like a battle cry from a video game cutscene. He knows that a moat and a gatehouse are not just defenses, they are statements, louder than any herald's trumpet. And somewhere beyond the walls, Bren sharpens his blade, unaware that the real battle may begin with a splash, a squeak, or a badly timed joke. The dawn broke over Bren's encampment like a greasy pancake, the sun spilling amber over a sea of mud-caked boots. In the distance, the stone walls of Castle Thornridge rose, their shadow cast over a moat that yawned like a beast's open mouth. Bren's men tossed their spears into the water, testing its depth with splashes that sounded like a chorus of squeaky ducks. The water was black as spilled ink, smelling of rotting kelp, and the faint tang of fear from the defenders below as the first catapult stone clanged against the far bank. The siege began its slow, grinding dance. Inside the keep, Eric the chief engineer crouched over a table littered with charcoal sketches and half-eaten cheese. He whispered plans for secret water channels that would turn the moat into a hydraulic trap, like a medieval version of a water park gone rogue. With a grin, he added murder holes, tiny openings in the ceiling that could rain down boiling oil. Or, on a bad day, soggy porridge, explaining each in layman's terms. Think of them as angry kitchen sinks. The apprentices scrambled to dig trenches that snaked beneath the moat, their shovels clinking like a jazz band in a rainstorm. By sunset, the first trickle of water surged through the hidden conduits, gurgling like a disgruntled dragon. The siege engines thumped, sending clouds of dust that tasted of iron and stale sweat. Inside the walls, the garrison's pantry grew as silent as a morgue, the last barrels of grain shrieking under the weight of hunger. Rats, emboldened by the smell of desperation, scurried across the stone floor, their squeaks echoing like a soundtrack from a low-budget horror film. Eric's water trap sputtered, sending a sudden splash of cold into the moat, shocking the attackers who slipped and flailed like toddlers on a slick floor. The defenders, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, cheered each splash as if it were a victory dance, their laughter mingling with the groan of strained timber. Bren ordered the drawbridge lowered, a massive wooden tongue that creaked like an ancient accordion under the weight of his troops. The bridge descended with a sigh, only to be halted by a sudden torrent from Eric's hidden sluice, turning the entrance into a slippery, foamy mess. Soldiers slipped, their armor clanking in a chaotic rhythm that reminded Eric of a badly choreographed tick-tock dance. From the gatehouse, the defenders poured boiling oil, actually a stew of onions and garlic, down the murder holes, the scent rising like a medieval pizza oven. Bren shouted, "Retreat," as his men flailed, the irony not lost on anyone who'd ever watched a cat chase a laser pointer. As night fell, the moat glowed with phosphorescent algae, casting an eerie green light over the battered siege lines. The attackers, now drenched, shivered like a pack of wolves in a snowstorm, their morale melting faster than butter on a dragon's breath. Eric stood on the battlements, his cloak fluttering, and declared, "Let them think we have a moat of doom. We have a moat of questionable plumbing." The siege crumbled, the gatehouse standing firm, its drawbridge still stubbornly stuck in the half-down position, a monument to both engineering wit and stubbornness. In the quiet that followed, the smell of wet stone and burnt onions lingered, a reminder that sometimes the best defense is a well-timed splash and a good joke. The sun hung low over the stone ramparts as the siege engines snarled like angry wolves, their wooden frames splintering under the weight of iron and resolve. Men in mail clanged together, their breath a fog of sweat and fear, while the clang of a battering ram echoed like a drumbeat in a war movie soundtrack. The outer wall, a bruised granite scar, trembled as the attackers hammered at its base, each strike sending a shudder through the defenders' bones. From the parapets, the garrison watched the siege tower wobble, a hulking wooden beast that seemed to whisper, "I am your new Arab." Yet the scent of damp earth and the distant cry of a raven hinted that the battle was only beginning. When the wall finally gave way with a thunderous crack, a tide of soldiers surged forward, swords flashing like a flock of angry fireflies. Their helmets glinted under the dying light, and the air filled with the metallic tang of blood already spilt. Just as the first foot crossed the breach, the gatehouse's massive portcullis, an iron griddle forged for doom, plummeted down with a deafening clang, slicing the sky and the attackers' hopes in half. The sudden drop sent a chorus of yelps, curses, and a lone cry of woe. That could have been a modern-day gamer discovering a hidden trap. The defenders, perched behind the iron lattice, smirked as the invaders found themselves trapped like cats in a medieval catnip jar. Behind the gatehouse, the moat lay silent, its surface a mirror of soot and moonlight, until a hidden sluice, secretly operated by a crank as old as the castle's foundation, was turned. Water roared up like a dragon awakened, flooding the stone floor with a cold, muddy surge that smelled of rot and river algae. The invading soldiers, already tangled in the portcullis' iron teeth, slipped and flailed, their boots squelching in the slime as if they'd stepped into a giant's bathtub. The sound of splashing mixed with the guttural shouts of men fighting both the water and each other, creating a symphony that would make any medieval bard blush. Even the castle's resident raven, perched on a crenel, seemed to cackle as if saying, "Welcome to the splash zone, newbies." A deadly stalemate settled over the battlefield, the air thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and stagnant water, a perfume no noble would ever commission. Both sides stared at each other across the churned mire, swords dripping, shields dented, and the occasional squeak of a rat scurrying over a broken helmet. In the heat of this pause, a hidden weakness emerged. A loose stone in the gatehouse's foundation, cracked by the relentless pounding, began to wobble ominously. The defenders, eyes widening, realized their own fortification might crumble if the battle dragged on, while the attackers, drenched and disoriented, wondered if they'd been lured into a medieval version of a reality TV trap. The irony hung heavier than the iron portcullis. Each side had become the other's unwitting prison. At last, a tentative truce formed, not out of honor, but out of sheer, soggy desperation. As both sides clambered for higher ground and dry footing, a weary commander muttered, "This is like that episode of Game of Thrones where everyone forgets the dragons exist." while a young foot soldier whispered, "At least we won't need a shower after this." The gatehouse, still half raised, creaked like a tired accordion, and the moat settled into a grimy stillness, reflecting the flickering torches like a broken mirror. As night fell, the castle's walls seemed to sigh, acknowledging that even the mightiest defenses are only as strong as the secrets they hide. And so, the tale of the breached wall, the trapped gatehouse, and the mischievous moat became a cautionary legend, told over mead to anyone who dared think a stone barrier could keep out a well-timed prank. The sky over the stone courtyard hung low, a bruised purple canvas that seemed to sigh under the weight of war. Eric, his cloak flapping like a flag in a bad medieval cosplay, barked the order to open the ancient sluice, his voice cutting through the clamor like a battle-hardened kazoo. The iron gates groaned, releasing a torrent that had been waiting in the moat's belly for a century of patience and algae. A cold, muddy spray hissed as it hit the stone, smelling of swamp, iron, and the faint perfume of fear. Even the crows perched on the parapets seemed to pause, as if waiting for the punchline of a joke only the stones understood. The flood surged forward, turning the once placid moat into a raging river that roared like a dragon with a bad cold. Invaders, armored and proud, found their boots sucked into the sucking mud, their shouts turning into gurgling sputters. One knight tried to rally his men, but his sword slipped from his grasp, clanking into the water like a misplaced cymbal in a heavy metal concert. The water carried away shields, helmets, and a particularly pungent smell of boiled cabbage that made the front line gag. Even the enemy commander, who had bragged about his iron will, was now drenched and looking like a soggy extra from a low-budget Game of Thrones episode. While the moat performed its aquatic ballet, the gatehouse's twin flanking towers sprang to life, their arrow slits flashing like the eyes of a caffeinated cat. Eric's men, perched on the crenellations, loosed a volley of crossbow bolts that sang through the air with a whistling sarcasm. Each bolt found a target, helmets cracked, ribs shattered, and a particularly unlucky foot soldier discovered that his mail was no match for a well-aimed pointy stick. The sound was a cacophony of twang, splinter, and the occasional surprised yelp, as if the battlefield had turned into a medieval rock concert. Even the stone gargoyles seemed to grin, their stone mouths forming a silent applause for the chaos. The water, now a frothing green beast, surged past the gatehouse, sweeping the remaining foot soldiers into its cold embrace. Bodies bobbed like wilted lettuce leaves, the stench of blood mixing with the dank, earthy odor of the flooded ditch. Eric watched from the battlements, his eyes glittering with a mix of triumph and the absurdity of watching a medieval version of Titanic, unfold on his own turf. The enemy's war cries turned into spluttering coughs as they tried to cling to the crumbling stone, only to be dragged down by the relentless current when the last of the invaders disappeared beneath the churning water. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the distant clank of armor sliding off a stuck foot. The flood receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a courtyard that resembled a battlefield after a particularly messy pizza party. Mud clung to every surface, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of victory and the sour scent of soggy leather. Eric, dripping and grinning, declared that the moat had just earned its doctorate in defensive engineering, a title he'd proudly post on the castle's notice board next to Master of the Sword and Chief Meme Lord. The surviving defenders laughed, their hoarse chuckles echoing off the stone, as they imagined future invaders checking the weather forecast before marching in. And so, the flooded finale closed like the last episode of a binge-worthy series, dramatic, a little wet, and leaving everyone wondering if the sequel would involve a dragon or just better drainage. When the clamor of battle finally faded, the battered stones of Bren's keep still echoed with the sighs of survivors. The men and women who lived through the siege gathered around the half-filled moat, its water now a murky mirror of the sky, and the corpses that had slipped beneath it. With a collective grunt, they hauled fresh earth, tamped it down, and sealed the cracks, turning the ditch into a liquid wall that glistened like a giant, angry koi pond. The gatehouse, scarred by flaming arrows, was lifted on timber rollers and set upon new foundations, its iron portcullis polished until it sang when lowered. Even the rats seemed to cheer, scurrying over the fresh mortar, as if applauding the rebirth of the fortress. The rebuilt moat wasn't just a ditch, it became a sensory assault. At dawn, the water smelled of damp moss and the faint tang of iron, a reminder that death still lingered beneath the surface. By midday, the sun turned the surface into a glittering carpet, while the occasional splash of a startled duck sent ripples that reflected the castle's newly raised banners. Children who dared to wade in the shallows shrieked with delight, only to be chased away by the gruff laughter of the watchman, who warned that the water was as unforgiving as a medieval reality show. Even the gatehouse, now reinforced with oak beams and iron studs, creaked under the weight of its own grandeur, sounding like an ancient dragon stretching its limbs. Word of the waterwards, rebirth spread faster than a gossiping minstrel on a lute. Lords from distant valleys arrived on squeaky carts, their cloaks fluttering like flags at a medieval comic-con, eager to see the famed moat and gatehouse. They crossed the bridge, feeling the cold spray on their faces and marveled at how the water seemed to swallow the sound of their boots, turning each step into a muffled thud. Inside the gatehouse, torches sputtered, casting shadows that danced like paparazzi flashbulbs on stone walls, while the newly installed iron portcullis dropped with a satisfying clang that could have been the soundtrack to a blockbuster battle scene. The lords whispered, half in awe, half in envy, that this defense was more than stone and water. It was a masterpiece of medieval engineering and a splashy revenge against Bren. To cement the innovations, the surviving defenders organized a pilgrimage for the next generation of lords, a sort of medieval field trip with more mud than a mud wrestling tournament. They marched through the winding path beside the moat, the scent of wet earth mixing with the smoky aroma of a nearby hearth where a stew of turnips and questionable meat simmered. At each station, a seasoned veteran demonstrated how to lower the portcullis with a lever that felt like pulling the trigger on a catapult, and how to flood the moat using hidden sluices that hissed like a dragon's breath. The lords, some clutching their polished helmets like smartphones, took notes on the spot, their faces a blend of concentration and the occasional grin when a prankster guard tossed a rubber duck into the water, causing a ripple of laughter. By sunset, the pilgrims were soaked, mud-caked, and oddly reverent, swearing to carry the waterward secrets back to their own keeps. As the pilgrimage wound down, the sun dipped behind the towers, painting the moat in molten gold and the gatehouse in a fiery silhouette that could have graced a fantasy movie poster. The defenders raised mugs of ale, their frothy heads spilling over like the very water that protected them, and toasted to the future, where every lord would remember that a well-kept moat is both a moat and a mood setter. A lone minstrel struck a chord on his lute, the notes echoing off the stone like a medieval meme, and someone shouted, "May your enemies drown in their own drama." Laughter rang out, mingling with the distant croak of frogs and the soft clink of armor, sealing the chapter's legacy in both memory and mud. The story closed not with a bang, but with the gentle lapping of water against the walls, a reminder that sometimes the best defense is simply a splash of ingenuity.